Raise your right hand. Do you and each of you swear that you will well and truly try the issue joined between the state of Wisconsin, the plaintiff, and Mark D. Jensen, the defendant, and unless discharged by the court, a true verdict give according to the evidence given in court, so help you God?
I do. Please be seated.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We're going to start the trial now, and before it begins, I want to give you a few instructions that I hope will help you better understand your functions as jurors and how you ought to conduct yourselves during the trial. Your duty will be to decide this case based only on the evidence presented and the law as given to you by the court. Do not let any personal feelings of bias or prejudice about such things as race, religion, national origin, sex, or age affect your deliberations. Do not begin your deliberations and discussion of the case until all of the evidence has been presented and I have instructed you regarding our law. Do not discuss this case among yourselves or with anyone else until your final deliberations in the jury room. You may be excused from the courtroom when it is necessary for me to hear legal arguments from the lawyers. Now, you're here to decide the case, what the facts are, and ultimately to decide, when instructed about what the law says, decide whether the defendant is innocent or guilty. And I don't have any role at all in what the facts are. That's your decision alone. My function is to keep order in the court and to make sure that the rules are followed both with respect to evidence and with respect to the presentation of evidence. So sometimes the lawyers are going to disagree about whether something's admissible evidence or not, and that is, they may get into a dispute about it, that I have to consider the legal positions and make a decision on it. And those are things you don't have to concern yourself with, because you are to decide this case only on the evidence which is admissible under our law. So that at those times when I'm having discussions about what whether evidence should be received or should not be received, you may be excluded from the courtroom. So you're not being deprived of something that you need to know, because if I sustain the objection, it's something that is not admissible, and there's reasons for that. These are not rules that just were developed or are personal views of mine. These are rules that have been developed over hundreds of years to make sure that a fair decision is reached in the case. So if I sustain the objection, that means that the evidence is not at the level that we consider something that can be used in the court. If I overrule an objection, that doesn't mean, well, I'll get into that in a little bit, but basically that explains why we might have discussions which may be extended outside your presence. So don't feel that you're being deprived of something at that particular time. If during the case you come in contact with the parties, the lawyers or witnesses, do not speak with them. For their part, they will not contact or speak with you at all. And if anyone attempts to speak to you concerning the case, please report that either to me or to the bailiffs immediately. Do not listen to any conversation about the case. There are a number of representatives from the media covering the trial. As was discussed earlier, what the media may report is not of the standard necessary for jury use in deciding the great issues which will be presented to you in this case, and for that reason, you must not read any newspaper reports or listen to any news accounts on radio or television about this trial. Do not watch or listen to any newscasts on television or radio which originate from Milwaukee, Kenosha, Whitewater, or Lake Geneva for the duration of this trial. Do not read the Kenosha News, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, the Janesville Gazette, the Week, the Midweek, or the Racine Journal-Times, or any article in any other publication or anywhere else that pertains to this case. Do not read anything at all on the internet which pertains to this case. Do not investigate this case on your own or visit the scene. Do not engage in any experimentation or research relating to issues, facts, or persons involved in this case. Do not consult dictionaries, computers, websites, or other reference materials for any additional information regarding this case or any issues which may pertain to it. Anything that you see or hear outside this courtroom is not evidence. You are to decide the case solely on the evidence offered and received at this trial. Television and photography will be occurring during this trial, but under no circumstances will televising or photographing of jury members be permitted, and you will never be pictured in any image which is broadcast or telecast, because none will be acquired. For those who may be interested, I have requested that the media make available to you after the trial is over access to all of the media accounts which will be telecast during the trial. It is critically important to the fairness of this trial that you adhere to the order that you not read, watch, or listen to any account of these proceedings. You must understand that a violation of this order will have serious repercussions, both for the integrity of the trial and for anyone who would violate the court's order. Your ability to remain without a sequestration order, which would require that you all be held in a hotel when you're not in session here for the duration of the trial, will depend upon your compliance with this order. And you must understand that any violation will be dealt with as a contempt of the court. Now, evidence is defined first as the sworn testimony of witnesses both on direct and cross-examination, regardless of the party who calls the witness. Second, any exhibits which have been received, whether or not they accompany you to the jury room. And third, any facts which the lawyers have agreed or stipulated, or which I direct you to find. Attorneys for each side have the right and duty to object to what they feel are improper questions asked of witnesses and to the receipt of other evidence which they believe is not properly admissible. You should not draw any conclusions from the fact that an objection was made. By allowing testimony or other evidence to be received over objection, I do not mean to indicate any opinion as to the weight of the evidence. You are the sole judges of the believability of the witnesses and of the weight of the evidence. You are not required to make notes during the giving of evidence in this case, but you may do so if you wish. You will be permitted to make notes during the giving of evidence, but not during opening or closing statements. You'll be provided by the bailiffs with materials. In taking notes, you must take care that it does not distract you from carefully listening to and observing the witnesses. You may use your notes during your deliberations to refresh your recollections. Otherwise, you should keep them confidential. After the trial, your notes will be collected by the bailiffs and they will be destroyed. You will not have a copy of the written transcript of the trial testimony available for use during your deliberations. You should pay careful attention to all of the testimony because you will be required to rely primarily upon your memory of the evidence and the testimony introduced during this trial. It is your duty as jurors to scrutinize and to weigh the testimony of the witnesses and to determine the effect of the evidence as a whole. You are the sole judges of the credibility, that is, the believability of the witnesses and of the weight to be given to their testimony. In determining the credibility of each witness and the weight you give to the testimony of each, you should consider these factors: whether the witness is interested or disinterested in the outcome of this trial, the witness's conduct, appearance, and demeanor on the witness stand, clarity or lack of clarity of the witness's recollections, the opportunity that the witness had to observe and know the matters and things about which the testimony is given, the reasonableness of the witness's testimony, the witness's apparent intelligence, bias or prejudice, if any, is shown, possible motives to falsify, and all other facts and circumstances appearing during the trial which tend either to support or to discredit the witness's testimony, and then give to the testimony of each witness just such weight and credit as you believe it is fairly entitled to receive. There is no magical way for you to evaluate the testimony. Instead, you should use your common sense and experience. In your everyday lives, you decide for yourself the reliability of things said to you by others, and you should do the same thing here. Now, the information in this case charges that on the 3rd of December of 1998 at the village of Pleasant Prairie in Kenosha County of this state, the defendant caused the death of Julie Jensen with intent to kill her. To this charge and the information, the defendant has entered a plea of not guilty, which is a demand that every material allegation of the information be proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Intentional homicide of the first degree is defined in the criminal code as being committed by one who causes the death of another human being with intent to kill that person or another. Before the defendant may be found guilty of intentional homicide of the first degree, the state must prove by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the following two elements were present. First, that the defendant caused the death of Julie Jensen. Cause means that the defendant's act was a substantial factor in producing the death. Second, that the defendant acted with the intent to kill Julie Jensen. Intent to kill means that the defendant had the mental purpose to take the life of another human being, or was aware that his conduct was practically certain to cause her death. While the law requires that the defendant have acted with intent to kill, it does not require that the intent have existed for any particular length of time before the act was committed. The act need not have been brooded over, considered, or reflected upon for a week, a day, an hour, or even for a minute. There need not have been any appreciable time between the formation of the intent and the act. The intent to kill may be formed at any time before the act, including at the instant before the act, and must continue to exist at the time of the act. You cannot look into a person's mind to determine intent. Intent must be found, if found at all, from the defendant's acts, words, and statements, if any, and from all the facts and circumstances in this case which bear upon intent. Intent should not be confused with motive. While proof of intent is necessary to conviction, proof of motive is not. Motive refers to a person's reason for doing something. While motive may be shown as a circumstance to aid in establishing the guilt of the defendant, the state is not required to prove motive on the part of a defendant in order to convict him. Evidence of motive by itself does not establish guilt. You should give it the weight you believe it deserves under all of the circumstances. In reaching your verdict, examine the evidence with the utmost care and caution. Act with judgment, reason, and prudence. The defendant is not required to prove his innocence. The law presumes every person charged with the commission of a crime to be innocent, and this presumption requires a finding of not guilty, unless in your deliberations you find that it is overcome by evidence which satisfies you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. The burden of establishing every fact necessary to constitute guilt is upon the state. Before you can return a verdict of guilty, the evidence must satisfy you beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty. If you can reconcile the evidence upon any reasonable hypothesis consistent with the innocence of the defendant, then you must do so and find him not guilty. The term reasonable doubt means a doubt based upon reason and common sense. It is a doubt for which a reason can be given, arising from a fair and rational consideration of the evidence or lack of evidence. It means such a doubt as would cause a person of ordinary prudence to pause or hesitate when called upon to act in the most important affairs of life. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt which is based upon mere guesswork or speculation. A doubt which arises merely from sympathy or from fear to return a verdict of guilt is not a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is not a doubt such as may be used to escape the responsibility of a decision. While it is your duty to give the defendant the benefit of every reasonable doubt, you are not to search for doubt. Search for the truth. The lawyers will now make their opening statements. Mr. Jamboys will make an opening statement on behalf of the state, and then we'll take a break. And after that, Mr. Albee will address you on behalf of the defendant, and then I think at that time we'll probably take a lunch break. Keep in mind that the purpose of an opening statement is to give the lawyers an opportunity to tell you what they expect the evidence will show so that you will better understand the evidence as it is introduced during the trial. I must caution you, however, that the opening statements are not evidence, and for that reason, as I indicated before, taking of notes is not permitted during opening statements. With that, Mr. Jamboys, if you're prepared, you may make your opening statement.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. In your search for the truth in this case, you're going to be hearing evidence that I guess will be broken down into, from the state's perspective, be broken down into chapters. And the first chapter is going to be presenting evidence about what was going on in Julie's life, in Julie's mind, from Julie's perspective in the last weeks, months, days, and hours of her life. On the morning of December 2nd, 1998, Julie Jensen was very ill. She was very sick. And you're going to hear from expert testimony about the first stages and the second stage and the third stage of ethylene glycol poisoning. It's all on the internet that her husband, Mark Jensen, was consulting in looking for ways to murder his wife in the weeks and months preceding her death. So, at the time on December 2nd, 1998, as Julie Jensen lay in her bed, suffering, desperately ill, her husband, Mark Jensen, knew exactly why she was sick, why she was ill, why she was suffering. As he lay next to her that night in the marital bed on the evening of December 3rd, 1998, as she was gasping breath, raspy, and barely able to breathe, Mark Jensen lay there next to her, knowing what she was going through because he'd read all about it on the internet in the months preceding her death. But Julie Jensen didn't know that on the morning of December 2nd, 1998. And even though she was desperately ill, even though she was terribly sick, she was happy. She was happier than she'd been in a long time. And you might wonder, why was Julie Jensen happy on this morning of December 2nd, 1998, when she was laying there, unknowingly dying? Well, even though she was terribly sick, even though she was physically uncomfortable and in some measure of agony, Julie was finally happy because her husband was finally showing her what she'd wanted all along. Julie viewed herself as a loving mother and as a loving wife, and all she wanted was some attention from her husband. She wanted her husband to love her and to care about her. And over the preceding several weeks and few months, she really wasn't getting any of that from her husband. He was being critical and cold, and in fact, she even thought that he was trying to poison her. She had come to suspect that for a variety of reasons, but she wasn't sure. And imagine, if you will, I mean, you folks know people that are married, have been married for years. Imagine how difficult it would be for any one of the people that you know who is married to come to the conclusion, to wrestle with even the idea that your spouse is trying to poison you. So Julie was wrestling with that, and it was hard for her to believe that her husband was trying to poison her. She thought maybe, she was seeing these signs, these evidence around the house and on the computer. She would see him working on the computer, and she'd kind of suspect that maybe he was trying to look for ways to kill her, but maybe he recognized that they were about to divorce, and he was looking for ways to make her look like she was crazy so that she'd get fearful, take the children, and tell the police and tell other people that her husband was trying to kill her, and then he'd have a perfectly reasonable explanation and make her look stupid, and then he'd be able to get the children. So she was wrestling with this in the weeks and the months preceding her death. So she didn't have that many friends, but she talked to the people whom she could talk to. She talked to her next door neighbor, Ted Voigt, and you're going to hear from Ted Voigt, and you're going to hear from his wife, Mrs. Voigt. And these are among Julie's closest confidants, particularly Mr. Voigt. She would confide in him. And he would offer her the use of their home. They had a lake home somewhere else, and he'd offer her, let her take the children and go there. But she was concerned that, first of all, Mark was very powerful. She perceived Mark as being very powerful. She believed that if she left Mark, she'd end up losing her children. And she also had no alternative means of support. So what was she to do? So she continued to talk to Mr. Voigt. She talked to a teacher, Teresa DeFazio. She even talked to her best friend, and her best friend, ironically, is Mark Jensen's sister, Laura Koster. And she confided in Mark Jensen's sister that she believed her husband, Laura Koster's brother, was trying to kill her. She didn't know what to do. She talked to Teresa DeFazio, and Teresa DeFazio was her son David's third grade teacher. And she talked to Teresa DeFazio quite a bit. And at one point she told Teresa DeFazio, after there'd been a parent-teacher conference, and Teresa DeFazio asked how it had gone, and Julie told her, was quiet, and then after a moment or two she said, I think my husband is trying to kill me. And Teresa DeFazio said, well, why would you think such a terrible thing? And then Julie laid out her concerns to Teresa DeFazio and said, well, maybe she'd seen this thing. He was trying to get, he'd written down syringe and some other words like that and made a list of things that they would never normally need. And Julie had theorized, well, maybe Mark's got a drug issue that she didn't know about. Or maybe he's just trying to make her look crazy or drive her crazy. She just didn't know. And Mrs. DeFazio said she should also talk to the police. So Julie did that. She tried to contact the police. She knew the Pleasant Prairie police officers because they'd been to the house on numerous occasions over the preceding years, because there had been this apparent history of harassment. And initially, both Julie and the police thought that the source of this initial harassment was a person by the name of Perry Tarica. And you're going to hear testimony that Julie Jensen had had a brief affair a number of years earlier in her marriage, during the course of her marriage to Mark Jensen. And this affair was with Perry Tarica. Somehow or other, Mark Jensen found out about the affair, and it was broke off very quickly. I mean, it was only a day or two, a few days long. But after the affair had been broken off, after Mark Jensen found out about the affair, they were getting these series of hang-up phone calls, and there were these photos being left around the house, and according to Mark Jensen, they were being left at his office or mailed to him at his office. And these photographs were all, I guess, adult pornography, you could call them. They presented pictures of women either performing fellatio or about to perform fellatio. They showed men with erect penises with a woman's face right in close proximity. Those are the kind of photos that are being left around the house in the years preceding Julie Jensen's death. And the police investigated these things, and they believed Perry Tarica was responsible, and they talked to Perry Tarica. But then at some point during the course of this investigation, they discovered that Perry Tarica had moved to New York. And there was no way that he was coming around here, moving their furniture around and leaving photos around the house, or leaving photos on the Mr. Jensen's truck or automobile at work. There was simply no way that Perry Tarica was doing that. And the police started to think, well, let's see if somebody else is doing it. So they put a trap and trace on the phone call with Mrs. Jensen, with Julie Jensen's permission. They tell Julie about it, and they told her, don't tell Mark. We suspect Mark is doing this, so don't tell Mark. And then during the trap and trace, there'd be no hang-up phone calls during the trap and trace period. They'd be on for a week, and they were getting hang-up phone calls on a regular basis. And then during the week that there was a trap and trace, there'd be no phone calls. And Officer Cosman would come back and ask Julie, well, there were no phone calls. Did you tell Mark about this? And Julie would concede yes, she had told Mark about the trap and trace because she couldn't keep any secrets from him after she'd cheated on him like that. She felt desperately guilty about having cheated on him. So she would not keep any secrets. So during this entire investigative phase, in fact, at one point, Mark and Julie had hired a defense, or had hired an investigator to to perform surveillance at the house and at Mr. Jensen's place of work. And of course, during the surveillance, no photos were left. Well, again, it was Mark Jensen that was paying for that. Now, so Julie had this prior contact with Officer Cosman, and she called and left a message for Police Officer Ron Cosman, and Ron Cosman wasn't there. And this was right around November 21st, and we know this because then what Julie did was she took a camera and she photographed some entries on Mark Jensen's day planner. And she wrote this letter. Pleasant Prairie Police Department, Ron Cosman or Detective Ratzenberg. She has Ratzenberg, his name is actually Ratzberg. I took this picture and am writing this on Saturday, November 21st, 1998 at 7 a.m. This, quote, list, unquote, was in my husband's daily business daily planner, not meant for me to see. I don't know what it means, but if anything happens to me, he would be my first suspect. Our relationship has deteriorated to the polite, superficial. I know he's never forgiven me for the brief affair I had with that creep 7 years ago. Mark lives for work and the kids. He's an avid surfer of the internet. Anyway, I do not smoke or drink. My mother was an alcoholic, so I limit my drinking to 1 or 2 a week. Mark wants me to drink more with him in the evenings. I don't. I would never take my life because of my kids. They are everything to me. I regularly take Tylenol and multivitamins, occasionally take OTC stuff for colds, Zantac or Imodium, have one prescription for migraine tablets, which Mark used more than I. I pray I'm wrong and nothing happens, but I am suspicious of Mark's suspicious behaviors and fear for my early demise. However, I will not leave David and Douglas, my life's greatest love, accomplishment, and wish, my 3 Ds, Daddy, Perrin, Mark Perrin, David, and Douglas. And then is signed, Julie Jensen. And this is a photocopy of that letter. Julie took that letter and she folded it up in an envelope. She put it in the envelope. She put her neighbor, Ted Voigt's name on the envelope. And she delivered the envelope along with a couple of rolls of film to Ted Voigt. And she said, hold on to this for me. And if anything happens to me, give it to the police. Well, then she heard back from Ron Kosman. And Ron Kosman came out to the house and picked up the film. Now remember, Julie, when she had spoken with Ted Voigt, she was concerned about calling the police because she think the police might think she was crazy. And she really was undecided as to whether Mark was either trying to kill her or trying to kill her and make it look like she'd committed suicide, or whether he was just trying to drive her crazy and make her think that he was trying to kill her so that she'd leave and then he could paint her as being crazy to the police and to other authorities. So she was reluctant to talk to Officer Kosman because of that. When Officer Kosman came out, she told him about the letter and she told him about the film, and he asked to have the letter and the film. She didn't want to give him the letter at that point, but she went and got the film. So she went back over to Ted Voigt's house and she got the film. She brought the film and she gave it to Officer Kosman, who had it developed. And then, now, I'm not sure if Ron Kosman remembers this conversation or not, but according to Ted Voigt, Officer Kosman came back to the house after the photos had been developed. And he saw Julie talking with Officer Kosman. And then he saw Julie walking away from Officer Kosman's squad car. And Julie was doing this. And then as though conveying to Officer Kosman, to Mr. Voigt, that Officer Kosman thought she was nuts for talking about this stuff. Now you're going to see the photograph that was developed. And what Officer Kosman will tell you is that when he had the photo developed, when he had these photos developed, it was just a bunch of writing. It didn't really mean anything to him. And he told Julie, there's really no basis for us to suspect that your husband is trying to kill you. And really, if you're concerned about that, you should go to a women's shelter, you should take your children and leave, you should do something like that. Officer Kosman will also testify that when he came out to pick up this film, Julie was initially very emotional and agitated and upset and was talking about how she believed that her husband may be trying to kill her. But then as she was talking to him, it's as though she talked herself out of that proposition. And if you think about it, it is such an absurd proposition that one's spouse is trying to poison you. It's just so difficult to believe. Isn't it kind of difficult to believe right now? Even as you're sitting here, isn't it kind of difficult to believe that one spouse would seek to poison another spouse? It certainly is an unusual way to end a relationship. Even when murder ends a relationship, it's not by poisoning. One party gets drunk and kills the other. That's the typical way it happens. A knife, a gun, strangulation. It's violent and it's quick and it's sudden. That's the way. If these things are going to end that way, that's how they typically end. So you can understand how Julie would be able to talk herself out of this absurd proposition that her husband was trying to murder her. And unfortunately for Julie, that's what she did. She talked herself out of the proposition that her husband was trying to murder her. That's after she wrote this letter. Because remember, this conversation with Officer Kosman, where she starts out being very distraught, very upset, very emotional, believing that her husband was trying to kill her. And right before his very eyes, she talked herself out of that. That occurred after she'd written this letter. She talked herself out of it. And then on December 1st, and Mark was at this point making a big show about how concerned he was for Julie, insisting that she go see Dr. Borman. Not realizing that really the real benefit in going to see Dr. Borman was that there'd be some prescribed medication. And then Mark Jensen would have a reason to providing her with something to ingest. She didn't want to drink the wine that he'd been out trying to get her to drink. She didn't want to eat the food that he was trying to get her to eat. In fact, she'd gone so far as to go to the local White Hen pantry to buy a chicken sandwich so she could eat something without fear of being poisoned. That's it. Now, again, that was before the conversation with Officer Cosman, where she took herself out of this. But Mark was having difficulty getting Julie to ingest this poison. And what a great way to get her to ingest some poison. Get her to go to the doctor, get the doctor to prescribe some stuff. And then you can get her to take some juice to help get down the pills, and you can lace the juice with antifreeze. I mean, it really worked out very well for Mark to get Julie to go to the doctor. But Julie didn't see it that way. From her perspective, Mark was taking care of her. So on the morning of December 2nd, 1998, at around 10 o'clock in the morning, Julie calls the next door neighbors and she talks to Mrs. Voigt, and she tells Mrs. Voigt, "Don't worry, you're not going to see me out and about today. I'm not feeling well, but Mark is taking care of me. Mark is being good to me." And Mrs. Voigt will tell you that when she was speaking to Julie, Julie's voice sounded different, and it sounded almost like she was drunk. And that's another thing you're going to hear, is that in the initial stage of ethylene glycol poisoning, it appears as though you're intoxicated. You know, you're unsteady, your speech is slurred, because really the effect that ethylene glycol has on you is very similar to the effect that alcohol has on you. And so on the morning of December 2nd, 1998, as Julie Jensen lay dying, lay desperately ill, very sick, very uncomfortable, she was nonetheless more content than she'd been in a very long time, because Mark was taking care of her. Now that's the end of the chapter as far as Julie is concerned, because nobody ever really hears from Julie again after that. She lapses in and out of consciousness. By the morning of December 3rd, 1998, she's really not aware of what's going on around her. Remember, she was rasping, barely able to breathe all night long. Her son David was describing it to one of his friends, another third grader, boy named Eric Schur, as this. She was breathing like this. And you're going to hear expert testimony that that's consistent with the third and final stage of ethylene glycol poisoning. Mark had been hearing that all night long on the morning of December 3rd, from past midnight right up to the time when he propped Julie up in bed so that her two small boys, David and Douglas, could come in and hug her and kiss her goodbye and go off to school. Now, David at that point was about 8 years old, and he was in third grade. Douglas was 3 or 4 years old. He was in preschool. But even though David was only in third grade, he knew his mom was desperately ill. And the boys wanted their daddy to take mommy to the hospital to get her better. Well, of course, Mark couldn't do that. So he made a promise to his sons. He promised them, if mommy's not better by the time you get back from school, then we'll take mommy to the hospital. And of course, children aren't taught to question adults. They listen to their parents. Douglas was taken to preschool. David went off to third grade. And Mark stayed there and watched his wife. And she was breathing, watching her breathing like that, semi-comatose. And so what did he do? What any husband would do. Gets in his car, drives off, and picks up a check, runs some errands, and comes back. And what happens then? Now, according to some accounts, Mark Jensen finds his wife dead when he comes back with the boys and calls the police. But according to the statement that Mark Jensen made to Aaron Dillard, a fellow inmate in the county jail, what happened was Mark Jensen came back from picking up that check, and to his dismay, Julie's breathing had gotten better. Julie was starting to recover. She was still unconscious. She was still very sick, but she was apparently on the road to recovery. And Mark told Aaron Dillard he panicked because he knew his children were coming home from school shortly, or he was going to be picking them up and bringing them home from school. And if Julie wasn't dead, they were going to be expecting him to take her to the hospital. So time was of the essence. He no longer had the luxury of allowing the poison to do his work. He had to do it himself. And so Mark Jensen told Aaron Dillard he rolled Julie on her side, sat on her, shoved her face into a pillow, and smothered her. Now, we didn't know anything about that at the time that we were investigating this homicide. We didn't know what Mark Jensen was going to say. On the evening of December 3rd, 1998, when law enforcement showed up, here they had an apparently grieving husband. He was crying. His wife was dead. He had no explanation. He said she'd been sick. Doesn't know how she died. Doesn't know how she died. We didn't really even know if we had a homicide or not, because there were really no discernible injuries. There was a strange thing, though. She'd been sick for 3 days, and he didn't take her to the hospital. I mean, we were suspicious about that. She'd been sick for 3 days. She was had great difficulty breathing, and he leaves her. We were suspicious about that. There were some suspicious things here, but really, and then you looked at Julie's face, and she had been laying on her side with her face in a pillow. You roll her over, and her nose or mouth was pushed off to one side, like this. I'd never seen anything like that. The police had never seen anything like that. But if you stop and think about it, what could be more entirely consistent with the description of the murder of Julie Jensen that was provided to Aaron Dillard than that? How could Aaron Dillard have known about the photograph that you're going to see during the course of this trial, showing Julie's face and mouth, or nose and mouth, pushed off to one side, as though her face was shoved into a pillow? I don't know. So when law enforcement and the prosecution started putting this case together a number of years back, we didn't know about Aaron Dillard. We also didn't know about Ed Klug, and you're going to hear about Ed Klug. We were putting together what's known as a very circumstantial case. We were thinking of it as like a big, complicated jigsaw puzzle. All these little bitty pieces, one colored this way, one colored that way, and you put that, and they only go together in a certain way. And once you take all these little pieces that are just kind of a jumble and you put them all together, then you see this picture. The jigsaw puzzle creates a picture of the guilt of Mark Jensen, the manner in which he murdered her. How did that come about? Because I'm going to tell you about that process first, because that's really how I had expected this case was going to be put together. I had expected it was going to be a laborious, time-consuming process, and it was, of assembling this little piece of evidence here and this little piece of evidence there. At the autopsy, we really didn't know what the cause of death was. After the autopsy, we didn't know what the cause of death was. There was no discernible evidence of it. And you're going to hear testimony that normally you don't test for ethylene glycol when you do a tox screen at an autopsy. That's a notable fact, because that's a fact that was related by Mark Jensen to Ed Klug in November of 1998. But I didn't know that back then. We didn't know that that Mark Jensen had told Ed Klug in November of 1998 that he was planning to murder his wife. We didn't know that. We didn't find out about Ed Klug until just a few months ago. So for the last several years, as we were putting this case together, what we had was evidence that was just kind of coming up a little bit at a time. The autopsy didn't tell us anything about really what caused the death of Julie Jensen, except that we knew it wasn't a gunshot, we knew it wasn't blunt trauma, we didn't know what it was that killed her. Then, a number of months after the autopsy, we got the forensic analysis back of the computer. Now, on the night of December 3rd, 1998, law enforcement seized the computer that was in Mark Jensen's den. And we sent the computer and the hard drive to the State Crime Lab, where it was analyzed by a forensic computer scientist using something called NCASE software. Now, the NCASE software package is one used by the FBI, and what it does is it'll take a hard drive and it creates a mirror image of it, and then it'll go through that mirror image of the hard drive and recover everything that's on the hard drive. Now, I had always thought, and I don't know how many of you folks know, I forgot how many of you know something about computers. I'm an idiot when it comes to computers. I know next to nothing about them. But I thought when I deleted something, it was deleted, it was gone. It was off somewhere in infinity. Well, it turns out that's not the case. It turns out that when you delete something on a computer, it still stays in the hard drive. It's just in something called unallocated space or something like that. It's still in the hard drive. And what the NCASE software does is it pulls all those bits off the hard drive and recovers them. So it was able to recover all the stuff that was pulled, most of it, not all the stuff, but a lot of the stuff that was on that computer. The internet history, the email communications. And what did we recover several months after Julie Jensen's death? Well, we found an internet history search for poisoning. And when does it start? Well, it starts sometime in mid-October. And one of the other things that we found were all these email communications between Mark Jensen and a woman named, at various times, either Kelly Labonte or Kelly Greenman. We talked to you during the voir dire about motive. Well, when you think of motive, think of Kelly Labonte, the other woman. During sometime in earlier 1998, Mark Jensen had switched companies. He'd gone from, I think it was Baird, over to Stifel Nicholas. And Kelly Labonte was an administrative assistant to Mark's boss in St. Louis, Missouri. And at some point, they got together. And they started having a sexual relationship, a sexual affair, a rather torrid sexual affair. Although at that time, of course, Mark was married to Julie, and Kelly was engaged to a guy named Mark Greenman. And in fact, during this relationship, during this sexual relationship between Mark Jensen and Kelly Labonte actually went off and married Mark Greenman, and she became known as Kelly Greenman. And as soon as she got back from her honeymoon, she recommenced her sexual relationship with Mark Jensen. But they were talking about getting together, and there was this email communication from October 16th of 1998. And you know, the judge, when he was instructing you about intent, so it doesn't matter how long the intent to commit murder existed, you're going to have a pretty good idea when the intent to commit murder commenced in the mind of Mark Jensen. There's no hidden agenda with this guy. It's right there on the internet. So we start with these conversations, this email from Mark Jensen to Labonte, October 16th, 1998, 9:21 a.m. Hey, want to run off somewhere? IDLY. Now, I don't know how many of you folks use the internet. Apparently, IDLY, well, it means I do love you. That's not apparently, we know that. It means I do love you. So, Mark Jensen's communication to Kelly Labonte, hey, want to run off somewhere? I do love you. Her reply, October 16th, 1998 at 7:23 a.m. And I don't know why the times are different like that, but her reply is, "What sparked this bold attempt at messing with me? Sounds wonderful. Where should we go?" And he writes about Windstar. They should go to Windstar. And there's back and forth about Windstar as a cruise line. Of course, by this time in October, she's married to Mark Greenman, and he's married to Julie Jensen. So there is some details to be worked out here if they're going to go off together on a cruise. And so Kelly writes in her email on Friday, October 16th, 1998 at 8:33 a.m. "So let's say I have until the end of the year to decide one way or the other, and then in January you can send in the deposit if I'm still in. Deal?" Mark replies, "Fair enough, but no deadline in deciding. Whatever time it needs to be figured out." And Kelly replies, "And do you have it all figured out?" And Mark replies, "I'm thinking so. Some details to be worked on, but then those are just the details, not the big issue." And Kelly replies, "It was the details I was wondering about." And Mark replies, "Details are just noise in the bigger picture." And Kelly replies, "And you plan on dealing with the details how?" And Mark replies, "One at a time." And she replies, Kelly Jensen, or Kelly Labonte replies, "Evasive little shit." And then later on, it's from Kelly to Mark. "You asked me if I wanted to run off with you somewhere. I'd love to, but there are issues we have to deal with. I'm not sure how I'll deal with my issue, thus the deadlines and agreements for any backing out that might be necessary. Do you know how you'll deal with your issues?" And Mark Jensen replies, "Are deadlines and agreements necessary? I'm not trying to pin anything down, and I got my ticket punched, had that conversation, heard the answers. We're just hanging out for lack of one of us making a decision, just need to decide what to do and make an announcement." Labonte replies, "Okay, deadlines and agreements are necessary because I don't want to let you down." Now, this conversation is going on, this email communication is going on October 16th, 1998. From the morning hours into the afternoon. And how was Mark planning to work out the details? Well, he was on the internet. You're going to hear testimony regarding this from our expert. On the morning of October 16th, 1998, between 12 a.m. and 12:21 a.m., Mark was on the internet, and he was looking up botulism, pressed garlic, and poisoning. Now, what's pressed garlic got to do with this? That doesn't fit in there, does it? Well, it turns out that pressing garlic is a very good, potent way to get botulism. So don't do it. You're not supposed to press garlic. But that was what he was looking at in the morning, between 12 a.m. and 12:21 a.m. Then he had these email communications with Kelly Labonte, where he's talking about figuring it out. How does he figure it out? He's just got to figure out the details. Well, of course, Kelly Greenman's detail is her husband, Mark Greenman. Kelly's thinking of a more conventional way to deal with her detail. She's going to divorce him. What's Mark Jensen's way of dealing with his little details? Well, then after the conversation, after the email communications, Mark's back on the internet that night, 9:57 p.m. to 11:04 p.m., looking up drugs, botulism, and nicotine. And what you're going to find is that if you do a word search on Mark Jensen's hard drive, the word that comes up more often than any other word is poisoning. Now, but Mark wasn't restricting himself to poisoning his wife. He was an open-minded sort of murderer and was looking for other ways as well. He considered blowing her up. He considered electrocuting her. He went to the anarchist cookbook. He was considering all of his options. And then you see sometime around mid-October, the word antifreeze, ethylene glycol, starts popping up. And then on December 1st and December 2nd, December 3rd, the word ethylene, there are a number of ethylene glycol sites that are searched by Mark Jensen. And because obviously he's wondering, why isn't this woman dead yet? I've been poisoning her, why won't she die? And you might wonder that yourself. Well, there's a very small amount of ethylene glycol that's discovered in Julie Jensen's system. Ultimately, by the way, the blood, the stomach contents, the urine was sent out to a lab. And so now we can talk about the science a little bit. There were 57 micrograms per deciliter of ethylene glycol in Julie Jensen's blood. That is such a small amount that for one of the labs, it was below their detectable, it was below the reportable limit. It's a very, very, very low amount of ethylene glycol to be found in the blood of a person who's dead from ethylene glycol poisoning. Because most people who die from ethylene glycol poisoning commit suicide. They ingest large quantities, and then 8 to 24 hours later, they're dead. They've got a huge amount in their blood, they've got a huge amount in their stomach, they've got a huge amount in their urine. But you see, one thing you're going to hear about ethylene glycol is that it, in and of itself, doesn't kill you. Drinking ethylene glycol, it's not the ethylene glycol that kills you. It's the metabolites of ethylene glycol that actually kill you. So the body has to process it, has to metabolize it, and the metabolites cause your body to become very acidotic. And once your body becomes acidotic, it starts producing oxalic acid crystals. And it's the oxalic acid crystals that are deposited in your kidney tubules that shut down your kidneys, eventually shut down your organs, eventually it kills you. Well, there was a very small amount of ethylene glycol in her blood. There was a small amount, about a teaspoon and a half in her stomach. And there was a significant amount of ethylene glycol metabolite in her urine. But her kidney tubules were full of oxalic acid crystals. And you're going to hear from from medical examiners that that's virtually diagnostic. Well, it is diagnostic for ethylene glycol poisoning. So Julie Jensen was poisoned with ethylene glycol. But a very small amount in her stomach, a very small amount in her blood, and yet her kidneys were full of oxalic acid crystals. Now you can hear testimony about the manner in which ethylene glycol is metabolized and the rate at which it's metabolized and the stages that people go through. And the first stage is one of inebriation. The second stage is you're having great difficulty breathing. In the initial stage, you're also thirsty. But you can't keep anything down. You're vomiting. You're intoxicated. You appear to be intoxicated. It's an unpleasant situation. Then the second stage, you have difficulty breathing. There's respiratory difficulties, and then the third stage is oftentimes characterized by unconsciousness and eventual death. Cardiac arrest. You just die. And if you ingest, like say 8, 10, 12 ounces of ethylene glycol, typical person is going to be dead within maybe 8 to 12 hours. But Julie was clearly manifesting signs of ethylene glycol poisoning on the morning of December 2nd. And yet she was still alive in the late morning of December 3rd, 1998. More than 24 hours in this little bitty 110-pound woman. How could that be? Well, you see, unlike a suicide, when you poison somebody, you got to give them a little bit at a time, because you want to do it surreptitiously. You can't give somebody a lot of ethylene glycol all at once because they'll know they're drinking ethylene glycol. So you put a little bit in with their orange juice, or a little bit in with the Gatorade, or a little bit in with that, a little bit in with that, to get them to consume the poison. The amount of ethylene glycol in Julie's system is not consistent with a suicide. It's exclusively consistent with a homicide. Now, we thought when we were putting this case together, we try to anticipate the defense. Well, the defense is going to be that it wasn't Mark that was looking up this stuff on the internet. It was Julie that was looking this stuff up on the internet. So we looked at when the computer was being utilized. The computer was exclusively being utilized when Mark Jensen was home from work. There was never any indication of any internet activity, any use of the computer whatsoever when Mark Jensen was at work. It was only when he was home from work. That's one thing. The other thing is, there was nothing on that computer that really pertained to Julie Jensen. Nothing. Julie was an avid gardener, and she was into her children. There was nothing from the schools, nothing about the schools, nothing about the children on the computer. There were no internet communications between Mark Jensen and Julie Jensen. All of the internet communications that were recovered on that computer were between Mark Jensen and his girlfriend. So we were putting this together, But we were thinking, well, even so, they'll argue that maybe she was using this computer when Mark was at home because she was trying to set him up or something. So we then found a series of actions on the computer that only Mark Jensen could have been doing, and which culminated in him looking up nicotine or some other way of committing murder, poisoning Julie. Because that would show to the jury. We thought at that time we needed to show to the jury that it couldn't have possibly been Julie. So we found this series of use of the computer. There was, first of all, Mark Jensen going on the computer and looking up some stock trading stuff. And Mark Jensen was a stock trader, a stockbroker at that time. Then he goes to the Stifel-Nicholas, his Stifel-Nicholas Microsoft Outlook account, and he pulls up the email communications, and he's reading the email communications that occurred that day between him and Kelly, thinking about his girlfriend, even though he's at home that night. Then he goes to the Stifel-Nicholas account, and he pulls up the personnel directory, and he looks up the name of John Jock Joseph. And he goes to John Jock Joseph, he pulls up the information about John Jock Joseph. Aha. We didn't know. Who's John Jock Joseph? Why is he looking up John Jock Joseph? Then he goes from there to looking up, I think it was nicotine, something like that, some poisoning thing. And it wasn't until a number of years later that we'd recovered an additional cache of paperwork that we discovered some notes that Mark Jensen had made when he was clearly interviewing Kelly. He was talking to Kelly over the phone. It was early on in their relationship. And he was having her describe each of her previous lovers, every one of them. Time, date, location, place. And there's the name, John Jock Joseph. Now, what's the significance of that? Am I trying to embarrass Kelly? No, I'm not even trying to embarrass Mark. The fact is, the only person who could have been interested in John Jock Joseph was Mark Jensen. Clearly, Julie would not have had any reason to be looking, had never even heard of John Jock Joseph. She'd have no reason to be looking up John Jock Joseph's name on the computer. The only person who would, so this was kind of from our perspective, an aha, gotcha moment. Only Mark Jensen could have been looking this up, and only Mark Jensen would have gone from stock trading to the looking up communications between him and Kelly to looking up John Jock Joseph, bingo, to looking up nicotine. That would only be Mark Jensen. So we thought that was pretty good. And not knowing what was to come, putting this case together, thinking that would be a big part of the jigsaw, wouldn't it? Because that shows that only Mark Jensen could have been looking this stuff up on the computer. We were putting together the case with that in mind. And then, a Friday before a hearing was to start, actually a Thursday night before hearing was to start, we're talking to Dave Nearing, who is a co-worker of Mark Jensen's. And Dave Nearing will testify. He'll tell you that he saw Mark looking up drug interactions on the computer at work. And after Julie's death, Mark was complaining to Dave Nearing about how we had his computer, we weren't giving his computer back, and how he wanted to get his home computer back. And Dave Nearing commented to Mark, well, gee, it's a good thing they didn't take your office computer. They could have taken your office computer and analyzed it that way. This conversation occurred on a Friday. The following Monday, Mark reports the hard drive burned out on his work computer. Imagine that. Isn't that bad luck? I mean, we would have liked to have got that hard drive, but the hard drive just coincidentally burned out between Friday afternoon when Dave Nearing was pointing out it'd be a good thing. It's a good thing the state didn't have that hard drive. And gee, I guess that occurred to Mark then too, because that hard drive suddenly got burned out over the weekend. But we were talking to Dave Nearing, that's what we were talking to him about. And then he tells us, well, of course, Mark had told Ed Klug back in November that he was going to kill Julie. Well, we had never heard this before. This was something new to us. And Dave Nearing says, well, he'd been hearing this, and so he confirmed with Ed Klug, and sure enough, Ed Klug had told him, yeah, Mark told me in November that he was going to kill his wife. So we got a hold of Ed Klug. And sure enough, here's what Ed Klug is going to tell you. He had just joined Stifel-Nicholas, just in September. In fact, Kelly and Mark had gone to his office in Wausau to help transfer the files over on the weekend from his previous company over to Stifel Nicholas. He said, of course, Kelly and Mark weren't much help because they were just making goo-goo eyes at each other the whole time and were locked up in his office. Didn't do any work. They were just hanging out with each other. But in early November, November 5th, 6th, and 7th, 1998, less than a month before Julie's death, there's something called the Blueprint. Now, the Blueprint is something that's sponsored by Stifel Nicholas. They bring all their stockbrokers to St. Louis, and they have training sessions. And stockbrokers, much like lawyers and physicians, they all have to have continuing education credits in order to keep their license as stock traders and stockbrokers. So the company sponsors this whole thing. And like any of you guys ever bought, any of those folks ever been on those things, you know that what happens is this: you go to the training session during the day, then you have dinner, everybody drinks, and then you go after dinner, you go somewhere else, and most everybody drinks. And a lot of people drink too much, some people don't, you know. Ed Klug was at that retreat, the Blueprint, with Mark Jensen. And Ed had just come into the company. About the only person he knew there was Mark Jensen. So they had dinner together. They drank before dinner. They drank during dinner. They drank after dinner. And then after dinner, they went to the bar and drank some more. And there were other people present. Kelly was there. Another woman named Dawn Cooper was there. There were some other people there. But the other people started filtering off, you know. But not Ed Klug and Mark. They were kindred spirits. They were staying there. And when they became alone, they started complaining about each other's respective spouses. Ed Klug was complaining about his wife. Mark Jensen was complaining about his wife. Now, Ed Klug will testify that he and his wife had been having some marital difficulties, that in fact, he had moved out and filed for divorce the previous year. And even though they'd reconciled and he'd moved back in, he still had some lingering discontent. And with the sufficient quantity of alcohol and beer and wine, it was coming to the surface. And he was telling this to Mark Jensen. And Mark Jensen had also had copious amounts of alcohol to drink, and he was thinking, aha, I've got a kindred spirit here. So Mark Jensen started telling Ed Klug about what he was going to do with his problem wife. He said you go on the internet and you find ways to kill your wife on the internet. And there's this drug that you can use that it's not typically looked for at autopsy, and it crystallizes you from the inside out. And he went on to describe how you give her Benadryl. She takes a lot of Benadryl, so you get her on the Benadryl, and then you give her the antifreeze, and it'll kill her. And Ed Klug was transfixed by this conversation. He would go back to his room every once in a while to use the restroom or something, and his wife would call. Now, his wife you can hear from Joan Klug, and she'll testify that she suffers from fibromyalgia, and she was suffering from fibromyalgia back then, and she doesn't sleep very well. She doesn't sleep through the night. And she knew that her husband was going to be up because he goes these things, he goes out and he drinks. And so she felt comfortable calling him and talking to him. So she called him several times that night. And the first time she called him, he tells her, well, I was down with Mark, and we were talking about, and he was talking about killing his wife. What? She's, well, don't go back down there with that crazy guy. Don't go. He said, no, I'm going back down. And she was opposed to him going back down there, but he went down anyway. And he would come back up every once in a while, and they'd talk some more. And he was telling her about, giving her basically a blow-by-blow description. And I don't know about your situation, but I know that in my family, my wife's got a much better memory than I do. And in this particular evening, Ed had been drinking and she hadn't been. So Joanne Klug actually has a better recollection of all that was going on than Ed does. And then the following day, on November 7th, Ed called her from the airport, told her he was coming home. And Joanne Klug had some questions. Well, how does the Benadryl kill you? I don't get that. And he says, oh, it's the antifreeze. You take the antifreeze with the Benadryl. That's what he's going to do. I don't know why Ed didn't tell somebody about this, but he didn't. But he did tell, well, actually, he didn't tell anybody in law enforcement. He told his two secretaries about it. He told his wife about it, obviously. But he also, when he got back, he told his secretaries about it, about this conversation he had with Mark. Then, less than a month later, December 4th, December 5th, something like that, he finds out that Julie Jensen had died. So Ed Klug comes out and tells his secretaries, Julie died. And one of the secretaries, I think her name was Stacy Bauer, says, my God, he did it. He killed her. Now, when Stacy Bauer will testify, she probably isn't going to remember the initial...
Your Honor. What's the objection?
The stating of the opinion that's improper.
Overruled, which will be discussed later.
I want to make clear, I don't want to... Certainly, nobody else's opinion besides yours counts. Not my opinion, not Mr. Alby's opinion, and not Stacy Bauer's opinion. And I didn't offer that, what Stacy Bauer had to say, as confirmation that Mark killed Julie. But you see, when Stacy Bauer testified the last time on this matter, she didn't remember Ed telling her that Mark had been poisoning his wife when he came back from the convention. She didn't remember that. But she did remember that when he came out and announced that Julie had died, she remembers saying, he must have killed her. He must have done it. So she remembered that portion of the conversation. So that's the reason I'm telling you about it. It's because it demonstrates that, in fact, Ed Klug did tell his two secretaries that Mark was talking to him about ways to kill his wife. In fact, right after the conversation, the following morning, first thing, Ed had spoken with Ron Ruck, another manager at Seifel Nicholas, and said, I don't know if I'm going to be able to take it and make it to the whole thing, because I was up all night talking with Mark Jensen. He was telling me about ways to kill his wife. So it's not as though Ed Klug was making a secret out of this whole thing. You can hear the testimony from Ed Klug. And why didn't he come forward? After he'd heard that Julie had died, he talked to his wife about it, and she said, well, whatever you choose to do, I'll stand behind you. So I guess Ed thought in his own mind, he'll wait for somebody to ask him. If somebody asks him, he'll tell him the truth. He certainly has never withheld the truth, but he didn't come forward, not for 8.5 years. We didn't find out about Ed Klug until late July of 2007. And so now you know what Mark Jensen was planning. I can't conceive of any reason that Ed Klug would have to not come up here and tell the truth. He certainly had reason to not come forward sooner because Mark was his boss. From November through February of 1999, he viewed Mark as his boss. And he was afraid of Mark. And he still is afraid of Mark. And you're going to hear testimony that will give you good reason that you'll understand why maybe Ed Klug just understands Mark Jensen. Maybe that's why he was afraid of him.
The objection is sustained. Confine your remarks to acquainting the jury with what you expect the evidence to show and not to arguing why the jury should believe one witness or another.
Thank you, Your Honor. Well, again, I hope I'm not giving you some impression that my opinion on who's telling the truth and whose isn't is something that you should take into consideration. You're the finders of fact in this case, not anybody else. But in determining whether or not Ed Klug had reason to be fearful of Mark Jensen.
I think you need to confine yourself to what you expect the evidence is going to show and not argue to the juries why they should consider the evidence in one light or another.
Well, what I believe the evidence is going to, thank you, Your Honor. What I believe the evidence is going to show is this, that after Mark Jensen, at some point during the course of that last hearing, Mark Jensen was reincarcerated. A new judge had heard the case, had seen the case for the first time, decided to change the bond. Mark Jensen was reincarcerated. And Mark Jensen is complaining to other inmates about Ed Klug. In fact, he's showing Ed Klug a transcript of Ed Klug's testimony to a number of different inmates in the county jail, getting their opinion about what about it. I mean, he showed it to Aaron Dillard, and Aaron Dillard will testify, well, man, looks to me like you're in a lot of trouble here. And then ultimately, he got Mark Jensen to admit to him that, in fact, he'd murdered his wife. But with respect to another witness, Mark Jensen was in custody with a fellow by the name of David Thompson. David Thompson is a bank robber. Aaron Dillard, by the way, has a record longer than my arm. And normally, as a prosecutor, I don't pay any attention to bank robbers or...
Again, I want you to... well, I think you could briefly refer to your hesitance about using witnesses of this caliber, but I don't want you to argue the case.
Judge, Mr. Jamboy's views aren't relevant, aren't admissible. It's not evidence that could be presented in this case about how he feels.
Well, I understand that, and that's why I've cautioned him to just very briefly, I think he can give some explanation as to his hesitance to use certain witnesses, but it'll be ended at that.
I object to any opinions of Mr. Jamboy's being admitted at any time.
Your objection is noted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, look, let's forget about me for a minute. You might understand that most prosecutors are not going to pay careful attention to a guy like Aaron Dillard, who's got a record as long as his arm. I mean, prosecutors try to lock people like that up, nor with bank robbers. But in the instance of David Thompson, which is not something ordinarily would be taken very seriously, David Thompson comes forward and says, yeah, Mark Jensen wanted to, and I were talking about what it would cost to have Ed Klug just taken out of commission, sat on during the course of the trial. And it was $500 up front, $500 later on. That's what David Thompson will testify to. Now, why would I pay attention to that, you know? Well, then it turns out that when you're locked up in the county jail, the only phone you can use is one where you collect calls out of the jail. And every one of those phone calls is run by the same company. I mean, every one of those, that phone is operated by one company. And every one of those phone calls is recorded and monitored. And every single one of those phone calls commences with a recording. When it's the person that receives the phone call picks up the phone, it says, hello, this is so-and-so. You're receiving a phone call from, and then the person's supposed to say their name, in this case, Mark Jensen, an inmate in the Kenosha County Jail. This phone call is subject to monitoring and recording. And so there are a number of these phone calls. One of the people that Mark Jensen called after this conversation with David Thompson was his mother. And he relates, remember how the boys used to, if Douglas was doing something that David didn't like, David would just take him and sit on him. And the mom really didn't know what he was talking about, and Mark was laughing about it and saying, yeah, it's kind of a Bachlian kind of a thing. And Bachl is the name that everybody in the family uses to describe Dan Jensen, Mark Jensen's father. I don't know why they call him Bachl, but they call him Bachl. Bachlian thing was his perspective. And he was talking about how somebody's going to help him. They're going to sit on somebody. And he may need her to do some things. Now, he didn't connect up her doing things with that. He had that conversation about sitting on somebody. And then later on, kind of in a disconnected way, he brings up, well, you may be talking to a Kim Thompson. You take this number down, call her up, and he gives his mother Kim Thompson's telephone number. And Kim Thompson is David Thompson's wife. So whatever significance you attach to David Thompson's testimony, completely up to you folks, not anything I would have to say. Take into consideration, it's not just David Thompson. It's Mark Jensen contacting his mother after he's spoken to David Thompson, apparently, seemingly doing some things that were necessary in order to accomplish this objective of having Ed Klug taken out of commission and sat on during the course of the trial. And Mark Jensen was talking about doing that with David Thompson and talking about fulfilling his end of that deal with David Thompson when he was talking with his parents. That's what the evidence is going to show. When you're considering the testimony of Aaron Dillard, again, that's entirely up to you in terms of what kind of credibility to assess to Aaron Dillard. But when you're listening to Aaron Dillard, listen to what he says and consider how could he possibly have known? How could he possibly have known some of the things he's talking about if Mark Jensen hadn't told him, hadn't specifically told him? After you've heard all of the evidence in this case, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to see the jigsaw puzzle of evidence that we put together, and that jigsaw puzzle of little pieces in and of itself shows the guilt of Mark Jensen. And all the testimony of Ed Klug and Aaron Dillard and David Thompson and a variety of other inmates does is it puts it all in perspective. It makes the picture even clearer still. And when you're done hearing the evidence in this case, you will see that Mark Jensen spent weeks and months obsessing and thinking about how he was going to get rid of his wife, and seized upon what turned out to be very nearly the perfect way to murder your wife. But not quite good enough. At least that's up to you, whether it's quite good enough. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jambois. Let's take a break of about 10 minutes. Please don't talk about the case during the break.
Judge, during Mr. Jambois' opening arguments, there were some statements regarding the jailhouse witnesses, Mr. Dillard and Mr. Thompson, along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, maybe I find my note, but it was basically that ordinarily he would ignore, he being Mr. Jambois, would ignore such evidence. He asked rhetorically, why would we pay any attention to that? And then went on to explain why he was giving attention to it in this case. That's vouching for the witness. It's improper. And that's why I objected. And the objection was overruled, but that was improper vouching. Because he's giving his opinion. He's like, hey, ordinarily this stuff wouldn't convince me, but boy, I'm convinced. That's the effect of that argument.
Is this the one where I cut you off after the word objection? Because I thought I had instructed Mr. Jambois that he wasn't to comment on whether how the jurors ought to view the evidence, and maybe not use the same words you did, but I did tell him to just state what he believed the evidence was going to show and leave it at that.
Yeah, and then
But anyway, your objections noted in the record.
And the other one was to Stacy Bauer, which I think will be, maybe an issue when we get to trial. I understand my objection was overruled, but her statement of, I bet he killed her, is, I think, effectively Hazelton-type testimony, too.
Well,
Or an improper, maybe not exactly Hazelton, but it's an improper statement as to her belief about what happened.
and it was not received, and Mr. Jambois actually saved me an instruction on it. It was not received to prove or to offer that witness's opinion, but really to explain that she must have had some prior reason to believe that this woman's husband would kill her.
In which case, I think it's worse, not better, because there's the same prejudice of her giving what her belief is, and then it's also requires her to speculate. She's not stating what she actually heard. She's just speculating about what she heard, and she really doesn't know what her source may have been for believing that. It may have been just something about how she looked at Mr. Jensen, or the fact that she saw him with Kelly.
And that's what your cross-examination is for. But I understand your objection, but I'm going to overrule it. Anything else?
No, Judge.
All right. Anything from the state? Okay, let's ask the jury to come in.
There was nothing wrong with the opening statement. But, so I thought there was nothing wrong with my opening statement, but I understand that people disagree.
All right.